Welcome to the Vegan Transformation Book Club, Episode 2. I'm so glad you're here, whether you are here with me live now or you're watching the recording later. And for those of you that are here live, please, I hope you'll post something in the chat, maybe share where you're joining from. And throughout this time, feel free to post questions or comments. I'd love to know how all this resonates or lands for you as we dive in. So I'm going to start with sharing my slides, and there'll be time afterwards also for questions or comments that you might have. But feel free at any time to throw your comments in the chat and to share where you're joining from. So here we are for the Vegan Transformation Book Club, Episode 2, The Courage to Live Your Values. And this is based on Chapter 2 in the book. And you don't have to read the book in order to benefit from what we're going to be sharing today. But if you ever want to read the book, The Vegan Transformation, it's available wherever you buy books, in paperback, ebook, and audiobook. So let's dive in. So today we're going to do a little mini recap from last episode, which was the first episode, and talk today about what is covered in Chapter 2, which is really the courage to live your values. What are values? Why do they matter? How does this relate to the vegan journey? And what happens when our values conflict, whether they conflict with others, people's interests and values, or whether our own values conflict within ourselves. And last of all, I'm going to share about an exciting program that I'm offering to just make you aware of that. So I have one person welcoming from southeastern Michigan. Welcome, Joe. So glad you're here. Thank you for joining in and for sharing that. Okay. So last episode, which was the first episode, and you can still catch it, by going back on my YouTube channel if you missed it. But I first shared a little bit of my own background and why I wrote the book, The Vegan Transformation, what led me to do the research and write it, and my own journey from someone who could never imagine myself being vegan or plant-based to, growing up in the Midwest, eating lots of animal foods my whole life, thinking like I could never handle cooking or anything like that, or change my diet or change my lifestyle. And then a whole bunch of things happened that led me to do that very thing. And it really transformed my life. And that led me to do the research on the emotional, social, and spiritual aspects of the vegan journey, because so many books have been written about the physical health changes, and also a lot about the ethics, so that we know why this lifestyle is ethically a good choice. But there wasn't as much about how does all this affect us emotionally and spiritually and socially. So that's what the Vegan Transformation studied, and I found ways that people's lives improved emotionally being vegan, and at the same time being vegan in a not vegan world can have its challenges. And so I think the findings that I found through my research not only represent like the positives you can have with a vegan lifestyle, but also highlight what is possible, that sometimes we have to nurture. It doesn't just always happen automatically. And also welcome from Evansville, Indiana, someone joining us from there. So glad you're here. So if you were at the first book club last month, when I shared the 7 resilience pillars, I'm curious if one of those resonated with you more than the others. And let me just show what those were. So the 7 key pillars that came through my research that the people I surveyed and interviewed said were the most positive changes in their life from being plant-based or vegan. It was alignment with core values, expanding your circle of compassion, greater meaning and purpose from living in a way that was aligned with the values, authentic fulfillment, meaningful connections with others on the same journey, like I experience here with those of you joining me, and self-empowerment over health. No one tells us that there's things we can do to improve our health and our, through what we eat, and being compassionate to animals also happens to be a way that we can choose whole plant foods that are also really compassionate to our own health. and spiritual deepening and interconnectedness. So, oh, and welcome, plant-based diet, a plant-based diet. So glad you're here. Yay. So I don't know if any one of those 7 pillars really resonated with you on your own journey, wherever you are on that journey. But feel free to share if any of those were things that either that you've experienced or would like to experience more of in your life. But today we're going to talk about the first of those, which was covered in chapter 2 in the book, which is, and it's interesting, this was the top thing that people reported to me, the top benefit they received from choosing a vegan lifestyle. I mean, many of us are afraid when we move to the direction of being plant-based and vegan that it's going to be restrictive or somehow it's going to limit us. But just coming out for a second here, what I found from talking to so many people that I interviewed for my book was that actually when people took the leap, when they had the courage to dive in and say, I'm going to eat and live in a vegan way, to be as compassionate for all beings, or even whether it was for health, whatever reasons, making that commitment, suddenly they felt better and freer than they'd ever anticipated. So we often underestimate the power of values and how important they are psychologically for us. But when we actually know our values and live by them, it can really make a huge difference for us physically, emotionally, spiritually. So just a brief, review of what our values, just it's helpful to think of a definition. They're sort of our moral compass, what guides us, what helps us make decisions in our daily life, the qualities we want to embody in the person we want to be. There's sort of a fundamental set of beliefs that guide our daily choices and our attitudes, and they're often there below the surface. We don't always give a lot of thought to what they are. And one of the quotes from my book, being out of touch and out of sync with our values is a major contributor to the emotional malaise and existential distress that many of us face. I mean, you can see in our world that there's a lot of disconnection with core values and how the choices a lot of people are making. And I think it plays a role in why a lot of people feel sort of lost or not okay in their life, maybe not knowing what their values are or knowing but not fully honoring certain values. And so I think all of us can experience that, even, whether we've kind of taken this vegan path or not, there's areas of our life where maybe we don't feel fully in sync. And so what happens when we, maybe act in ways that don't fully fit with our values? You've probably heard this term, cognitive dissonance. It was first described by a psychologist, Leon Festinger, back in the 50s, but it's basically a concept of when we're either holding 2 conflicting values or we're acting in ways that just don't align with values that we have. And this, is a common thing. There's many ways this can show up. Maybe you value being healthy, but in the past, maybe you ate foods that really weren't healthy. And maybe in the past, maybe you valued exercise, but then you weren't exercising. So those are all ways that cognitive dissonance can show up. Yes, and I appreciate Joe sharing. For me, it's truly all the pillars that hold core value in various degrees. The 2 most prominent pillars seem to be meaningful connections with like-minded others and self-empowerment over health. Those are huge. I mean, and they make life so fulfilling. But all of them hold value, you add. Thank you for sharing that, Joe. I would agree. And, today's topic, which is values alignment, I found that it was sort of the core pillar that in a way made all the others possible. All the other 6 of the pillars that I listed there, basically it's hard to have fulfillment or purpose or meaning or that connection with like-minded others if we're not honoring our values. So knowing our values and honoring them and aligning with them, that can make so many other shifts possible. So yes, being able to connect with others who care about the same things, which will be a topic in a future book club when we also get to that chapter. That was one of my favorite chapters. So how does cognitive dissonance then fit in with our vegan plant-based journeys? Well, there's a few different ways it fits in, but maybe the biggest one is this idea that, most people care about animals. And that shows up in the money we spend on animals, from what we spend on our companion animals, what Americans donate to animal welfare programs and also environmental causes. Um, and even surveys across political affiliation, race, and SES show that the majority of people want animals, including farmed animals, to be treated compassionately and humanely. And yet at the same time, meat consumption has increased more than 40% over the last 60 years. One of the statistics that I came across showed that the average American consumes 264 pounds of meat a year, and that's been going up. A few years ago, I think the statistic was 225. So it's a lot, and it just keeps increasing, which is also having an impact on our health and the environment, as well as the animals that are affected. And so some of you have probably heard about the term carnism. I couldn't, for a long time, when I first became vegetarian and then later moved to vegan, I really thought that once other people understood what I now understood about what happens to animals and also the health benefits of a plant-based diet, when I learned about Dr. Dean Ornish's work about reversing heart disease, that was very compelling to me. And, I thought when I shared it with people that they would be on the same page with me. But yet, as many of us have experienced, we might share whether it be the ethical reasons for moving in the vegan direction or the health reasons for a whole food plant-based vegan diet. But sometimes just people are not interested or open, and I didn't understand for a long time until I learned about Dr. Melanie Joy's research. She's a social psychologist that many of you may have heard of that wrote the book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows. And for her doctoral research, she studied that very question of why is it that compassionate people and rational people, once, they just are kind of blocked to learning what happens to animals or wanting to change their diet once they learn more of what happens. And she coined the term carnism, which really describes this invisible cultural belief system that basically conditions us that it's normal, natural, and necessary to eat certain animals and only certain animals, because that differs from culture to culture, what the culture views as food versus maybe companion animals. But this is so ingrained, we don't really question it, why a pig might be viewed as food, but a dog or a cat we see very differently. And it just sort of, we grow up with it. And, as children, we might have questioned it or felt sensitivity to all animals, but we learn to bury that and to just go along with what we were raised to believe. And so, once we have a value and we're maybe realizing something we're doing is not in alignment, in this case, maybe something happened where you had been a meat eater or, an omnivore before, and then something led you to go plant-based or vegan, whether for animals, health, the environment, or some other reason. But before that, how did you handle your cognitive dissonance? How did you approach that? And they find that there's usually a few ways we handle it once we realize we're kind of out of alignment with our values. We either try to change how we view the situation to sort of, I guess you could say, justify it. We might compartmentalize, we might deny, for example, beliefs like, well, animals don't really suffer, or some animals aren't worthy of moral consideration, or what I eat really doesn't make a difference. So you might think about, did I have any, certain justifications that I used to tell myself that kept me ignoring, I guess, the impact of my food choices? Or the other choice, once we realize we're in cognitive dissonance, is to change our behaviors to actually match our values. And that's when someone moves towards reducing their meat eating or becoming vegetarian or plant-based or vegan, or just moving on that continuum of change. And so in my research with the people that I interviewed for my book, what I found was when people did take that step and commit to a lifestyle change, there was this huge sense of peace that many people described. You know, for example, becoming vegan has allowed me to align with my highest values and enjoy happiness, peace, and joy. I love that I've regained my health and I'm living the compassionate life that I should have always been living. Another said, there is weight off my shoulders to no longer be involved in animal cruelty, although I didn't know that weight was on my shoulders until it was lifted. I don't know whether you can resonate with any of these if you're on the vegan path or already vegan or plant-based, you know, whether any of these experiences are things you've also experienced. And the third quote, there's an incredible sense of confidence and inner peace, knowing you are living in line with your true values. This feels like I'm my authentic self for the first time. And I can personally resonate with that. I was, as I mentioned, growing up in the Midwest, I had meat or dairy with pretty much every meal. I thought that that was, as I noted, normal, natural, and necessary. I thought I needed it to survive. And when I learned some things about factory farming and animal agriculture, you know, first the ethical part in the treatment of workers, and then the ethics of the animals, and then over time the health stuff started to kind of come in as I kept reading more. And you know, there was this piece when I finally just said, okay, I'm going to do this. And for me, the hardest part was the social part, being different from people around me and having to speak up in social situations. But there was sort of this sense of being authentic and true to myself when I just had the courage to do that. Even though for me, being an introvert and being sort of a harmony seeker, that wasn't always easy. And I know for some of you that might be different. You might not have any problem with that. But some of us are a little bit more reserved in social situations, and it doesn't always come so easily. But at the same time, overcoming that kind of discomfort with speaking up and honoring what really I truly believed, it's led to so much joy and peace and growth that I wouldn't have experienced otherwise. And not to mention probably saving me from some of my family history of heart disease as well. So being kind to the animals has also been kind to me. So I want to invite you to think about, what are your core values? And some of the ways you can think about that is thinking about things like, well, what matters most to you? What kind of person do you aspire to be? What are the times you feel most at peace with yourself? A lot of times when we're feeling at peace, you know, it's because it's reflecting that certain values are in harmony in that moment. And also, when do you feel distressed or not at peace? You know, that can also be a sign that values are not being honored. So you might have times when, you know, maybe somebody else is doing something that kind of goes against values that matter to you, or maybe you yourself are. And then what happens when you have conflicting values? Maybe you care about a few things at the same time, and sometimes there's something that's happening that's making you have to figure out how to honor seemingly conflicting values that might be coming up for you. And it's a really helpful thing to do. You know, you can do this on your own after this session, but just to really think about, well, what might be my top values, and make a list. And there are also online lists of values where you can look at them and see which ones really resonate for you. But values are things like integrity, compassion, kindness, health, sustainability, generosity, commitment, devotion, spirituality. There's a lot of different values, and you may have a lot of values that are important to you, but sometimes we can narrow it down to 3 or 5 that really reflect what really we want to live by. And for me, a few that I've come to when I've done this kind of exercise are like compassion, integrity, and freedom and autonomy, I think, being free to be myself. So I'm curious if any values jump out at you, just you can just write them down for your own self, or you can also share them if any of you want to share. And what's interesting is, as I mentioned, I think the challenge for vegans is, or those on that vegan path, is sometimes the values that led us to go vegan can also interact with the things we're dealing with in our daily life. Because as I've mentioned in the first class, vegans make up maybe 2 to 3% of the population at the current time. So we're a minority. And so when we're at social gatherings or family events or holidays, chances are, unless we're with our vegan friends, we might be either the only vegan or we might be eating differently than those around us. And so it comes up from time to time that our values of honoring compassion or health or sustainability can conflict with what's going on in our environment and what is available. I heard a really interesting term called choice architecture, which I think is such a great term. And it describes that when we go shopping or we go to events, the choice architecture around us is set up around meat eating. It's not set up generally around being a plant-based eater. And the same is true for just if you're trying to purchase all your products vegan and cruelty-free, that it's just things are not set up for that to be easy. So think about, how your core values might sometimes conflict with what's happening in your life around you and your relationships. So you might have a core value of compassion, kindness, and nonviolence, not wanting to harm other sentient beings. You might also have values like honoring your integrity, having freedom and autonomy, and being authentic. You also may value treating others with respect and seeking them to treat you with respect in return. Some of us like to have harmony and a sense of connection and understanding in our key relationships, and that's important. And then there's times where, too, we might have more fear-based drives that are pulling us, like wanting to avoid conflict or disagreement or tension. And some of us don't really enjoy those kinds of situations. Maybe you have a personality type where you don't like to be an inconvenience, or you don't want to stand out or be different. So sometimes all these different feelings and values can kind of conflict in different situations where maybe I want to honor my values to be vegan, but I'm in a situation where my loved ones are eating these other foods and I have to figure out how to navigate that. Or someone makes a critical comment of what I'm eating and I have to figure out how to handle that while honoring my values and at the same time honoring my relationship, because I also value my relationship. And so that can be really challenging, this kind of conflict between being true to these values that lead us to be vegan or move on that vegan path versus the values of, I guess, getting along in society. So I don't know whether these are ever things that you've had to face or might have been a struggle or maybe earlier on your journey. So I want to give you a few reflection questions. So, as you think about some of the things I've been talking about, these kind of conflicts we can face, thinking about separating out what are my core values that really I want to live by versus times I'm falling into limiting patterns like, oh, I don't want to inconvenience anyone. Well, is that really a core value or is that just a fear? What if I really were to honor my value of compassion or health and learn new skills to speak up more assertively for what I need, and thinking about things as not either or, like, oh, I either have to honor my vegan values and alienate everybody or make everybody else happy and ignore my vegan values. How do I find a way to honor both? How do I find a way to honor what matters to me and my needs, my health needs, my compassion values, while I also stay connected to my loved ones? How can I communicate in new ways that bring greater mutual understanding, where I can try to understand what their concerns and questions are, but also share where I'm coming from? And, finding ways to speak your truth, but then release the outcome. So if maybe I'm sharing, I'm now eating vegan and I'd like you to be supportive of me when I'm making this vegan choice. But then I also have to release the outcome of how that other person responds. I can't control their response. Maybe I'd love my loved one to go vegan too, but I can't control whether they choose to do that or not. So just kind of being aware that sometimes we have to find new ways to share what matters to us so that we can also connect with this other person who may not yet be where we are on the journey. I think that's the biggest challenge sometimes for us as vegans in a not yet vegan world, trying to navigate this. And I don't know whether you can resonate with this, whether you've had times where your own values bump up against, sort of your social relationships in the world around you. And how have you dealt with that? I want to share a story that kind of represents someone's journey to navigate that very issue. Someone who had described herself as formerly a people pleaser, and someone that maybe in the past had not spoken up for her needs, who decided to become vegan after she learned on a podcast about animals and the ways they're harmed in animal agriculture and other industries. And it just led her on this path. And so she was a new vegan at the time I interviewed her. Maybe she'd been vegan for a year. And so her story is actually shared in the book in chapter 9, I believe. So yeah, so definitely a plant-based diet resonates with this kind of values thing. Thank you for sharing that. So at any rate, Shannon shared that when she first became vegan, the hardest part was, how am I going to handle the holidays and my family expectations? My grandma has this pumpkin pie that everybody expects me to eat, but it's not vegan. And, all the foods that the family ate were, that were just part of their traditions were always, meat-based, dairy-based. And so that first holiday, she barely spoke up. She brought, 4 or 5 dishes so she'd have something to eat, but no one else ate them, and no one else tried to bring anything vegan. And it just was, she felt really kind of left out and like she didn't fit in. But by the next holiday, she was a little bit better, where she kind of talked to her family more in between about why she was choosing to be vegan, why it mattered to her, what it meant to be vegan, what foods were included or not included. And she brought more foods for the Christmas holiday, but really tried to replicate some of the recipes that the family had liked, but make vegan versions of it. And this one went a lot better. The family said, yeah, these are pretty good, and, were more supportive. And each time she just kept communicating more about her values, why it mattered to her, how they could help her by contributing foods that sort of maybe left out the dairy and used a plant-based margarine instead, that sort of thing. And over time, there were really a lot of changes. While her family did not become fully vegan, her mother stopped having dairy because she found that it actually caused her inflammation and GI discomfort. Each member of the family started making shifts towards more plant-based, and they were definitely more supportive of her, because she wasn't pressuring them to change. She was asking them sort of to be her ally. And as they supported her, they started to learn more without being defensive. And they also made changes that helped their health and connected with their own compassion. For example, her husband realized that pigs were as smart as, I think, a 3-year-old, the statistics or the research shows. And when he learned that, he didn't want to eat pork anymore. So just little by little, her changes influenced her loved ones. And she also grew a lot because she learned that her needs mattered, and she started to be more true to herself. So it was sort of an example of where she was living her values and also honoring her value of connection to family and finding a way to navigate that, where they moved along a continuum of change along with her. It was not always easy. It was ups and downs, but she was a great example of someone learning, especially in the early stages, to navigate that. So I'm going to come out of the slide so we can, any questions or comments we can dive into. But I just want to share some resources with you. If ever you want to dive into any of these things in the book itself, the book has reflection exercises in each chapter where you can go deeper with some of these topics and how it relates in your own life. I view the topics there, those 7 pillars that I shared with you that are covered through the book. They're from the field of positive psychology, which is really the psychology of flourishing. It's the psychology of how do we, in a tough world that is not always easy to live in, how do we honor our best well-being, and what are the different ways and pathways to be as emotionally healthy as we can in a world that can be tough and stressful. How do we honor our physical health? How do we honor our emotional health and our spiritual health? And so the 7 pillars really dive into ways you can do that, and reflection exercises and stories that help you on your journey. So, and it's for anyone wherever they are at on the path, whether you're sort of curious about the vegan lifestyle or already vegan. I strongly believe those of us who are on that vegan path have to nurture our emotional well-being, so this is sustainable and enjoyable for us, so that we can not only sustain our own lifestyle, but maybe plant seeds for others around us. So there's the book. I have different, on my website, different emotional resilience classes and resources. I have a meditations thing under my resource list on the website, and also, of course, the YouTube channel. I share different videos. In fact, in the last couple of weeks, I've posted a few videos. One was about navigating relationships where you might experience conflicts. So if that happens for you, check that video out. I think it's about handling family and social conflicts. I mentioned to you earlier, I'm offering a new group coaching program called the Vegan Resilience Intensive, which is in June for 4 different Tuesday nights starting June 23rd. And the QR code here is, you can look at that to connect with it. It is on my website under services, but it's called the Vegan Resilience Intensive. And if you're vegan and just want support for the emotional aspects of the vegan lifestyle to navigate social and emotional challenges that may come up for you, and to feel more at peace and more confident in how you handle those, that's what this is about. So do feel free to check that out. And just for a free resource, I have a free vegan emotional resilience toolkit as well, which has 5 different resilience tools that I think are helpful for anyone, probably whether you're on the vegan path or not, but just especially geared towards those of us who are. So please do check those out. So I'm going to come out of the slides, and first of all, just thank you, all of you who have shown up. And I wondered, if you have any comments or questions about values or the challenges in living your values, please feel free to comment or share in the chat. I'd love to hear from you. And this can be a tough thing sometimes, this whole living our values, especially in a world that maybe doesn't reflect them. So being really compassionate to yourself those times that it's hard, or maybe you're not perfect. It's always about growing and learning. The research on, lifestyle change and honoring our truth shows that it's not about being perfect, because none of us can be, especially in an imperfect world. It's about doing what you can, learning and growing when there is a setback, trying to align with your values as much as you can in any situation. And when things don't go quite right, or you do make a mistake, or you do have a setback, adopt a growth mindset where you can say, what didn't work here? And how can I learn and grow from this? What would I do differently next time so that maybe I'd handle it better and be even more true to myself? And those times when your values conflict with something that's happening around you, finding a way that you can honor both of your values, that value of compassion and health, and at the same time, the value of connection with others, and perhaps building a greater understanding with other people where they can be curious, maybe like, wow, this is really working for her or him. How can I learn more about this? So, well, in a moment, we're going to be wrapping up. I just wonder if you can think about over the next month, before we meet for our next book club, what are your core values, and how can you honor your core values even in those situations where there's a conflict, and kind of honoring both types of values at the same time, your value for connection and your value for compassion and vegan living. So I want to just have you think about that and notice where that comes up for you. Joe here is mentioning purchasing choices, as you mentioned in the paperback copy. That's a work in progress, especially buying clothing items, health and beauty products, and all that packaging. Oh my goodness, yes. It's really hard. I mean, I've been told that animal products are in a lot of different things, including my computer parts and my car tire. It isn't always easy to find products that are fully cruelty-free, fully free of animal products, and add in, maybe concern about plastic and other environmentally, not good things. It is really challenging. So I appreciate you bringing that up. That was on page 54 in the paperback, where it's like a values exercise. Let me see if I can find it here, where it just asks, how do your purchasing choices fit in with your values? Most of us are unaware of the connections between our values and what we consume, since we rarely see the process by which our food and other items are produced. This is by design, since corporations know that most of us would not want to buy items whose production involved injustice towards workers, violence towards animals, or harm to the environment. To know whether our food or other items we purchase are truly humane, sustainable, and cruelty-free, we will likely need to do some research. And I mentioned some websites like the Environmental Working Group, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, Humane Society of the United States, and other organizations that have ethical and environmental guides that can help you. Here's the book, by the way. So thank you so much for sharing that. I think it is a work in progress for many of us to discover which items are kindest and most sustainable for our own well-being, for compassion for animals and workers, and for the planet. But I think rather than feeling like, okay, just because I can't do everything, why bother? I think align steps forward and keep deciding, a step forward on that path, and having our line where we draw in the sand. For me, once I've decided to become vegan, it's like, okay, I'm not going to consume animal products in my food. And then I work towards getting some of the other stuff more in line with that too, like clothing and other purchases. But I think that is an ongoing process, and not let that stand in the way of doing steps forward in whatever way is aligned for you. So thanks for sharing that, Joe. Well, next month, I just want to share, we're going to be diving into compassion. One of the things that changes for many people on their vegan journey is opening their compassion further to more beings than before. Sometimes, even though we're compassionate people, we compartmentalize our compassion, where we only hold compassion for certain people and certain animals and certain creatures, and not others. And sometimes we also forget to include ourselves in our circle of compassion. And so part of our journey is expanding that compassion and finding where maybe we are kind of having blind spots in certain areas. But that was one of the blessings that many people discovered on this vegan journey, is starting to awaken to that. So I want to just thank you so much for joining me. And I'd love, if you're watching this now or later, please share comments or questions in the chat. I hope you'll join me next month. Let me see when the date is for that. Hold on. So next month is June 24th, Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. I hope you'll join me then, and just wishing you a wonderful few weeks ahead and many blessings wherever you are on your path. Thank you so much for being here, and look forward to talking to you next time. Take care, everybody.